Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we have Lawrence Lundy-Bryan with us. He's the partner and head of research with Outlier Ventures, which is a prestigious venture capital fund in the crypto space based in London, but they invest in projects all over the world. And we will talk about something that will be dear to the heart of many people listening to this, which is about decentralized governance. And Lawrence will explain in more detail how there's no such thing as decentralized governance for SSI and blockchains. And we will just quickly review in the second slide what we're trying to do here at SSI Meetup. Our main goal, if you go to the next slide, Lawrence, is to push the global SSI community in the world, and it's open to everyone. If you're a company, a private person, or community, you can participate in this and join us here. And all content we're sharing is a Creative Commons by Share Alike license, which basically means you will be able to reuse this material. We are doing a recording of this presentation, but also all these slides are uploaded into Google Slides, and we will provide a link where you will be able to download it. And the only thing you have to do is to give credit to Lawrence and Outlier Ventures and to SSI Meetup, if you want to reuse this material, and you can reuse the material from this presentation and all the other 25 presentations we've been doing over the last 12 months. And we're celebrating this week also our 1-year anniversary, which is really cool, and that's why we're having 2 sessions this week. Today we're talking about decentralized governance. Tomorrow, Drummond Reed will be reporting back from the Internet Identity Workshop from San Francisco about his main impressions and things that moved over there. And if you have any questions during this presentation, please just use the presentation tool, the question tool you have here in the application. And yeah, please just ask them now, during the presentation, at the end of the presentation. And Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us today, and I really look forward to hear what you have to say. Your article is very exciting. I hope you will be able also to share the link at the end where you shared it in Medium. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure to be invited on to the SSI Meetup. So, what I'm going to talk about today is give a brief overview of Outlier Ventures, a brief overview of our vision of a future, our sort of investment strategy, and then get on to the sort of heart of the matter, and try to answer sort of a fundamental problem in the space, which is how do you govern digital communities with their own money? That for me is, of an Outlier, is a core question that needs to be answered. I'll then suggest a potential model for how to govern digital communities, based around the separation of powers. And then I'll spend some time talking about the implications of that model for SSI. And as Alex said, this presentation is off the back of a lot of work that we've done internally, a lot of thinking that I've done, and sort of the conclusion was there is no such thing as decentralized governance. It's quite provocative, it's meant to be, but it's from experience working with our portfolio, from being a venture investor and seeing hundreds of projects on a monthly basis, and essentially struggled with the lack of political and philosophical moorings from sort of the projects, the software projects that I was seeing. And so this article was a sort of way of putting out some early thinking, a potential model, really for feedback and to sort of kick around with the community. So it's by no means a final model, it's by no means a fully fleshed out model, but rather a counterpoint to the prevailing narrative in the community today. So to start, it's worth just running you through who Outlier is. An Outlier was established in 2013, one of Europe's first venture firms dedicated to blockchain technology. And one of the key insights that we had, and I think what we've sort of built the firm around, is this concept of it's the blockchain use case was first peer-to-peer electronic cash or finance, but actually what it represented was a way of moving data around and attributing value to that data. And so we framed much of our thinking around something we call convergence, and that is where there's a new emerging data ecosystem, and that's from the production, the distribution, the consumption of data, right? So if you imagine at the bottom, the production of data, how so much more data is being produced in the modern world with the Internet of Things and new types of devices. We're capturing more data, and then to start thinking about how that data is distributed, how it moves around systems, how it's validated, how it's authenticated, and then at the sort of end state, nobody really cares about data actually. What they care about is the insights and the automation that can occur from that data, and that's what we consider to be the consumption of data. And we call that the convergence concept. And so we work with seed and growth stage startups that are also committed to that open and decentralized future. Good. Okay, and here is our convergence stack, modeled on the OSI framework, hardware at the bottom, applications on the top. This is how we see an open and decentralized future. So what we're trying to do here is to try and frame the way we see this world emerging and all of the components that are required for that world to exist, but not just to exist, to replace the broken web that we have and to enable a more equitable data economy. And so you can see there under verification, probably the most relevant area for the audience would be authentication, for which we've just got some examples in here, by no means comprehensive, as you can imagine, but what we're saying here is we are interested in partnering with projects that are committed to open and decentralized technology applied to authentication. So we see each of these components in this stack as over time becoming increasingly open source and open networks and open hardware, also becoming, and I hate to use the word decentralized, what I actually mean is no single owner of the network. So it can be multiple owners of the network, so from sort of more than one all the way through to thousands as required. Of course, centralization normally refers to one single owner, and decentralization speaks to the whole range of users and owners from two upwards. So that's why I find it quite a challenging term to use. But fundamentally, what we're saying is this stack becomes open, it becomes decentralized, and over time we think that tokens or cryptographic tokens can become a critical component of each of these technologies. That's not because it's a way to raise funds, but actually because many of these technologies will need incentive mechanisms inbuilt for them to be used in the way that is beneficial for the overall stack. So fundamentally, Outlier is focused on partnering and supporting any project in this stack that is building a more equitable data ecosystem. And with that, I'd like to touch upon the meat of today and what we see as a problem in the broad blockchain industry today is how to govern digital communities with their own money. The reason why I frame it like this is to kind of take a step back for a moment and think that actually we are part of a, 50, 100-year shift from land-based coordination, nations and supranational organizations, to digital opt-in communities. And it's not always clear. Progress isn't always one-directional. But what is clear is that increasingly humans are opting in to digital communities, and the breakthrough that we had with Bitcoin and subsequent experimentation using distributed ledgers and cryptographic tokens is that those digital communities now have the ability to issue their own money or financial instruments, and that component, that issuing of their own money, is actually a change in substance of what those digital communities are. And I think the reason why that gets to the heart of the challenge is that it was very easy when technology was PCs, or PCs, laptops, smartphones. It's very easy when they're discrete objects. It becomes much more challenging when everything around us increasingly has sensors and is connected. And what that means is technology isn't really an industry anymore or a market. Technology is all around us. And by technology, I guess what we actually mean really is the ability to compute and store data, and that to be connected to a network. And what that means is that every part of society is being reshaped by that. And so there's no such thing as sort of Airbnb as a technology company, or Uber as a technology company. Uber is a logistics company, and Airbnb is a hospitality company. And I think that sort of pervasiveness, this so-called ubiquitous computing, the more that it does, the more capabilities that technology has, the more it erodes the monopoly of land-based communities, in the sense that if previously the state provided almost all of your daily needs and services, as well as the sole monopoly on cash within that network, or fiat, as well as identity, as well as all the other things that the state provides, and it was very clear of the value that it added. But you are finding that more and more of those services are being provided by digital communities. So we're sort of seeing this blurring, and as we see this blurring, we end up creating these global digital public utilities, the sort of scope of which is only now possible. So you can argue that Facebook is a public utility. You can make the claim, and I'm sure that claim will be made by Elizabeth Warren and others over the next few years. But the fact is, most of people's social lives exist in and around a privately owned enterprise, and that's to some extent okay. I mean, we have the internet, and we have the W3C managing that, and we have DNS, and we have lots of ICANN. We have lots of protocols that are managed by some by private companies, others by foundations and community memberships. But the challenge becomes when those networks can issue their own money. For me, that becomes the heart of why we now have to answer questions of governance. We can all look at W3C and complain, or or look at some of the challenges that they've faced in governing. But broadly speaking, it's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. But now, if we start talking about billion-dollar networks, and if not trillion-dollar networks, the challenge becomes ownership of that network. So ownership of the Bitcoin network or ownership of the Ethereum network. Becoming a dominant stakeholder in that network is really what the Bitcoin debate is around, or at least between core devs and miners and other participants. Certainly within Ethereum, there's been lots of conflict around different stakeholders and their needs and wants. And really all you're seeing is a sort of pulling and pushing from different stakeholders to exert control over a network. And that's to be expected. And it's my contention that if we are talking about building a global public utility that must be used by all, whether that's monetary value, cash, whether that's assets, whether that's identity, then it's too valuable, too socially important to be built and owned by a single network owner. And for me, this is the threat of Facebook ID, which I would imagine equally to the audience is a threat. And so the key question then is moral, not so much technical. And you find in the crypto community at large that was seeded by still dominated by technologists, in the sense that we are still at the very early stages of building networks and software, but some of the questions and challenges aren't really technical questions to solve by engineers. They're actually more moral questions. And by that, I mean, fundamentally, it's self-interest versus group interest. It's rules versus Nozick. It's liberalism versus libertarianism. These are philosophical questions about how best to coordinate scarce resources. And so I think there's certainly a lack of discussion. I think Koala as an organization do a good job at least of raising some of these issues. But really my contention is that we need more political scientists and we need more, honestly, philosophers, or at least people minded to think more about liberal arts, to have a say in how some of these networks are developed, and to understand that many of the discussions and the nuances of the details of how systems are built are not really technical questions there at all. They're questions of how many decisions should the underlying protocol make, or the core developers, how many decisions should they make? Really, we're led currently by a very strong libertarian tradition seeded from Bitcoin, where we appear to have made the decision that everything must be quote unquote decentralized before really understanding what all of the different problems are. And so my article, and therefore this presentation, is really to advocate for a potential new solution, not so much new, but new for this industry, which is the separation of powers, a model that we all at least are aware of, if not fall under, certainly in the US and elsewhere, but sort of the Montesquieu spirit of laws proposal, where you separate government, or in this case the network, into three to reduce the potential for the concentration of power, which is ultimately what we're all trying to achieve when we say we want things to be decentralized. What we're actually advocating for is to limit the concentration of power in one person or body, and therefore I think that we should look at these real world main nets, if you like, these nation states with their different implementations of the separation of powers, but to take a very pragmatic look at exactly what decisions need to be made and exactly who and when those decisions need to be made. And again, going back to my claim, there is no such thing as decentralized governance. I would argue that there are a few critical, you could argue constitutional questions which require very broad-based, inclusive governance, i.e. as many people as possible, but there are the majority of questions of a network do not need so many people to vote on any specific decision making. And so there's a balance between efficiency of decision making and inclusiveness of decision making. And again, that is a political nuance, not so much a technical nuance. So here is the proposal. It is to see modern day crypto networks as three separate things. Currently, we have the development team, the core devs, which you can sort of see as the executive. They're the ones that implement the law, right? They're the ones that have a vision, quote unquote manifesto, of what the values of the network should be and what the roadmap needs to look like and what features are required. Really, it makes perfect sense that in early stage nascent networks, those that have the vision and the passion to build the network are the ones that you should see originally as the executive. And really, we could stop the presentation here when it comes to the executive, and most software projects are just the executive. And I think that's how most software projects are currently implemented today. I think that we need to go above and beyond that for these global public utilities. And we need to think about a legislative. And the legislative is currently seen as the foundation, right? So the foundation in most cases was set up out of Switzerland or Singapore as a body that would issue the cryptographic tokens predominantly for tax reasons. But in doing so, most networks sort of separated powers to some extent. And you can see from the sort of Tezos, I suppose, dispute between the core development team and the foundation of what happens when roles and responsibilities aren't clear, and it wasn't clear that the foundation saw their role as budgetary and required budgetary sign-off, and that wasn't quite what the development team thought. And we see this now with Blockstack, are a good example, and Aragon. They sort of have a foundation, and that foundation has an allocated pot of capital for which it distributes as grants if projects meet their milestones. And so it sort of becomes a bit of a treasury more than a legislative. But they are the early implementations of that separation of powers. But that's only really signing off of monies. It's not really acting as you would see in the national body, a national legislative. It doesn't create law, right? There is no body that is making policy proposals and turning that into law. To some extent, the legislative is the network, in the sense that anybody can issue a BIP or any proposal in any of the different networks. But in reality, very few users are actually involved in network policy, because in order to propose a policy change, or let's just use the terminology of the separation of powers, in order to create law or propose a new law, you must understand deeply the network, and by that the technical nuances of the network. And in most cases, that falls in the hands of a very select few that really understand the network and have both the time commitment and the technical understanding required to contribute. So we do see on-chain governance, like Dfinity or Tezos or Decreed as well, which are sort of experimenting with delegating some sort of voting on law, and time will sort of see if that can turn into a robust voting mechanism whereby lots of different people can propose law and it will still be implemented, and that will look much like sort of direct democracy, right? Much more like Switzerland than sort of a representative democracy. But my contention is that networks would be much better off trying to find this balance between efficiency of decision making and broad-based decision making. You can always ask everybody what they think. The challenge is finding consensus, not in the technical sense, actually in the social political sense. And so I think the challenge is how to encourage participation in the sort of creation and voting of network rules. We already find voter fatigue being a challenge. Voter turnout, can be sort of around 40% in countries like Chile. And how will asking everybody to vote on every new policy turn out? I hope that we can experiment with ways where people are truly engaged with the network and vote on many different issues, but ultimately that's going to require a different take on voting systems today. So we may end up with quadratic voting, which Vitalik is pushing for Ethereum, and there's lots of great experimentations about different voting systems. But ultimately, I do wonder why, after so many years and 200 odd nation states, that we've sort of settled on a separation of powers, obviously not in each of those 200, and certainly there are many nations for which they don't have this separation of powers, and this is a very Western-centric view, I understand, but nevertheless, in those Western liberal democracies, you end up with a select voted few that are tasked by the politic more broadly, or the citizens, or the network, to create law, and they are given the time, they're paid so that they have the incentives to do a good job, to understand the things they're voting on, and to propose and create law that they think will be beneficial to the overall country, nation, or in this case, network. So I think that there's a good argument to say that once we have an executive team that is tasked with building the network or adding certain features, there should be a separate body, whatever we want to call it, a Congress or a Parliament, that is tasked and paid to suggest and create law and to act act as a check and a balance on the core development team, and to represent the views of the overall network. Because right now we have networks that realistically are used by a very few people around the world. And if we want to scale to Facebook levels, and we want to address the needs of billions of users for, let's say, identity, then is it right that billions of people's views are sort of to some extent listened to, but ultimately the software development team or the leadership can decide what is on the roadmap or what needs to be done? I mean, Facebook is a very good example, as is Twitter and as are others, that have global impact, but very little input from users to actually change the way in which the product works. So, not to belabor the point, I think that there could be a role for a organization or a group of people that represent the whole of the network, and we can call them delegates if we want, but nevertheless a select group of delegates that either represent a certain jurisdiction. We could imagine, could be quite interesting to think that there could be a German representative to the Ethereum Foundation and a British representative to the Ethereum Foundation and a Kenyan representative. But of course, that is just using the land-based community paradigm that I mentioned earlier on. What might make more sense is that there might be a cryptographer that represents the views of the network on security policy, or there might be some sort of finance or a CFO, for example, somebody that's managed treasury for a nation state. Imagine a sort of a chief economist, for example, that is paid and represents the views of the network. So lots to experiment with, but ultimately I think we will converge on a delegated body that helps create law and hold the executive to account. And then finally, probably the most challenging one is the judiciary. Because we saw from the Ethereum fork, an Ethereum Classic fork, that when there is a conflict on the network, there are no dispute resolution mechanisms. In the nation state, we call it the judiciary, and it has lots of different layers that are responsible for taking decisions, and lots of different levels of courts that are responsible for checking the decisions of the lower courts, and it can get wildly complex depending on the country. But fundamentally, the role of the judiciary is to interpret law, and there is an element of enforcement there, but very much to interpret law, because law is messy and it's written down and it can be interpreted in different ways. Now, I understand the original, or at least the perspective of the DAO, which is that code is law. And if you follow that logic, code is law, therefore any dispute should be able to be resolved directly within the network itself. It should be written down. There is no room for interpretation. It should be as simple as code, smart contracts, and execution. And bad behavior or punishment can be resolved with market rewards or incentives. But there's another sense, which is miners to some extent interpret law, right? You can have a network upgrade, but if miners don't decide to enforce or change the software, then they decide what is enforced on the network. But Again, that's quite a technical take on what a judiciary's role actually is. A judiciary's role should be to be a dispute resolution mechanism. And I think that until we get to a point where there is a suitable conflict resolution mechanism for disputes on a network, the building of trust is a challenge, because really you need to build trust in these systems, that the systems are not, there is no concentration of power. And you know that with an executive or a legislative, that helps, but I think there always needs to be a third body or organization whose role it is to provide a check and a balance on the executive and the legislative, and to offer a sort of independent third-party neutral view to uphold and to interpret the law. Now, this is obviously biased in the sense that I'm personally of the view that code is not law, and that it's almost impossible for us to perfectly write code that executes in the way that that everybody expects it to execute. And beyond that, I think the more and more that technology permeates society, we again ask questions of morality and ethics, and we ask questions of values, and we are yet to be able to adequately agree on a particular political philosophy that is quote unquote correct or right or accurate. And certainly we wouldn't agree if we're having a conversation in Iran, China, Singapore or New Zealand. We're likely to have very different views on what what should be focused on within the network. And so I think the point really is that we're not just creating software anymore. And if we were, then we could choose to have a corporation, and we've got lots of corporate governance, we've got lots of corporate law, we've got generations of corporate law which enable us to quickly and easily create a software product and to generate revenue and profit, and shareholders to be the stakeholder which derives most value from that, management derives value, workers less so, and lots of other stakeholders like the environment or any other extraneous stakeholders that aren't considered do very, very poorly. And when we're dealing with public utilities, there is not necessarily a role for the state, but we have to ask questions around, well, what happens when people can't afford to use this? And what about where the market fails? There needs to be a role where everybody is served for the best of the community. And again, that is because I have a political viewpoint on this, very much in the liberal tradition. And again, I can understand a libertarian that might argue that that isn't the role for a global utility or a network. Instead, the role should be for the protection of property rights and nothing else, and to be as small as possible. And that's a perfectly legitimate argument with a perfectly rich thread of philosophical thought, but it's just not my view. And so there's a real challenge that we will need to face sooner rather than later, which is we're now scaling to serve billions of users. Can our existing governance structures support billions of users? My contention is no. And so I think there's a couple of things to think about them. One is, what does inclusive versus efficient decision making mean for self-sovereign identity? I'm phrasing it like this because what I mean is startups and lean startups, right? The idea is you want as few decision makers as possible. You want to make decisions as quickly as possible. You want to have a very strong leader. Certainly as a venture investor, that idea of a strong leader that has a mission and passion to build a product to change the world is something we look for. Now, that makes for very efficient decision making if they make the right decisions, but it certainly doesn't make for particularly inclusive decision making. So we have a challenge. One is, we know that the governance models, or let's say the hierarchical corporate structures that exist and have thrived and have enabled us to create both products and services that scale to the globe. And so there's no doubt that it's been effective from one looking through one lens, but you could argue it's been extraordinarily ineffective from a stakeholder that might view the environment as the predominant stakeholder in building products and services. So it's been ruthlessly efficient for returning capital to investors as a stakeholder, but not so good over the years at environment and workers and other stakeholders. So how do we balance the known fact that startups and corporate governance is effective at building products and scaling versus the need to make sure that we get broad-based inclusive decision making, because we are setting out from day one to serve billions of users, all with different views and priorities, and therefore in order to build a sustainable and robust and inclusive network or self-sovereign identity solution, we need lots of input to make sure that there's lots of legitimacy and buy-in. And how do we balance the two? For me, there's probably a question of, it's probably a question of timing more than it is a question of either or. And maybe there's a model where you start with a very consolidated decision-making process. You reach a certain milestone, a certain number of users, after which you maybe create a legislative that starts small, and then you hit another milestone and that legislative gets bigger, and then maybe there's the seeds of a judiciary that gets set up, and maybe all of this stuff is timelined based on milestones over a sort of a 10-year period. That maybe balances the two appropriately. Then the devil is in the detail at that point, exactly what milestones are appropriate, because you could end up spending all that time thinking about creating this wonderfully inclusive decision-making process and governance model, ultimately a constitution, but the startup fails because it ran out of money. And so you're putting all this thought into something that that never materializes, and that's the challenge. So sort of kind of leads you to think about this sort of standards versus corporate versus national governance question, which is some of the feedback from the article is, this seems like overkill, right? We're creating software. Why are we talking about nation state governance? The decisions are really about software, about creating useful applications. And again, maybe we're thinking about this too soon, but I guess pontificating can sometimes be a useful exercise. But why worry about what national governance looks like, because we don't even know what color to make the the UX, right? So we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here. And so sort of the model that's tended to work up until now is sort of standards bodies, right? Many of the audience will likely be involved with one or more, and standards bodies have thrived, certainly in the age of information and communication technologies for sure, and even more specifically internet technologies. Has done a particularly good job at being a steward and advocating on behalf of some core values of the internet, and then the long journey of identity, digital identity, leading to sort of what we now understand as self-sovereign identity. Again, has been on that journey, and I guess the question I would pose, without necessarily having the answer, is if self-sovereign identity is wrapped up with some form of value, be that a token, or at least sort of on-ramps and off-ramps to a token economy, then it becomes extraordinarily valuable, and therefore I would argue needs to be protected from the consolidation of power. And that's not just because any particular project or any particular network will have nefarious views. It's just that bad decisions can be made when there's no checks and balances. And so it's, standards bodies may work for something like this, but I would argue when the stakes are this high for global identity or global value networks, that a different governance or a more inclusive governance model is a better way to protect in the interests of the majority. And so I guess the final point before I take some questions, if there are any, would be to again make the claim that we're not building software, we're actually building a global public utility. And that globalness speaks to that we need to incorporate the values and the decision making and the motivations of billions of users ultimately. It's public, so this needs to be the public or citizens need to be a core stakeholder as we build these networks, not just technologists that know how to use it, or a technocracy that understands the nuances of the network. This needs to be publicly, not just speaking for public accessibility, but public understanding. There needs to be a trust and a legitimacy built, and that this is a utility. It's not, it can't be, and many of these networks can't just be for the benefit of a few, because we'll end up with monopolies greater than we have in the Web 2 internet era. We'll end up with monopolies on identity, or monopolies on the issuance of cash globally, or securities globally. And actually, you think that when we get to that scale, the consolidation of power, we thought it was a problem in nation states, or we thought the consolidation of power in Facebook has led to negative outcomes. You can only imagine what it would be like if there was a single owner of a identity network, or even to that point, a single owner of a global logistics network or e-commerce network. Monopolies can be bad, not just from a competition and price and consumer protection perspective, but from a societal perspective at large. To go back to the very idea that I posed, there is no such thing as decentralized governance. I think the key message is that we need to step away from the answer being decentralize everything. Actually, what we need to do is to think, what exactly are the decisions that need to be made? And for the stage that we are at, how many, who needs to be a part of that decision in order to balance efficiency and inclusiveness? And then over time, to see a roadmap that makes each of those decisions either overall the whole network votes on them, or few parts of the network, or delegates. What I'm excited about is that we're in an age of experimentation around governance models. I certainly don't see them as negative or ill thought out. I just think that we have this model, the separation of powers, which has created some remarkably sustaining and robust decision-making processes in light of, very challenging circumstances around wars and economic collapse, and many of them are still sustaining, and therefore we should look to what has been successful in the past rather than rip up the whole book and say we need to decentralize everything. And I suppose as a final thought for the implications for SSI, I think SSI is and should be considered a global public utility, and therefore the governance of it needs to be seen in that light. And I think I would propose something akin to a separation of powers for a global public utility. So on that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening. And if there are any questions, happy to follow up now or follow up after.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lawrence. I mean, there's one question that came already in a couple of minutes ago from Ivy. He was asking, don't you think this model, separations of powers, is accommodated in centralized systems like cloud providers operate on the same principles?
In the sense that, I guess, cloud providers are providing compute, storage, and networking, and a lot of, let's say, computational resources. And I do think that we don't see a separation of powers in governance. We do see an architectural separation of powers, but ultimately, the product roadmap for any one of those products, whether it's AWS or Google Cloud, ultimately comes from the largest shareholder with supermajority voting rights, likely the founder of each of those large cloud providers. And therefore, by governance, I mean, ultimately, who is responsible for the decisions? And when it comes to sort of censorship, or when it comes to deciding whether the API should be closed down or not, on very, very few occasions, which anything other than what's best for the market, investors, or the leadership are thought about. So the priorities are just different. And I don't think the priorities of what's best for leadership, management, and shareholders should be the guiding principle behind global public utilities.
Okay, I have another question here saying, what are good examples in the crypto space for decentralization, like based on the examples you just gave about the separation of powers?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that a few different companies have reached out subsequently to speak about it. I think the first thing to say is we're very, very early, and that there are none that have done this to the extent at which I would propose, mainly because the judiciary is the hardest component. So in the judiciary, we have Ethereum that are trying to sort of interface with the existing legal world. We have Kleros and Aragon that are sort of trying to create a digital judiciary of jurors and use game theory. So the sort of judiciary is very, very early stages. And I think I would point to organizations like Aragon, actually, and like Blockstack. I mentioned them both, but I do think they're particularly good examples of where they've empowered the foundation to take on more responsibilities, and have a view that the foundation acts as a countervailing force to the development teams. But beyond that, really, it's few and far between. I would be keen if anybody knows of others that are doing it really, really well. Part of the reason that I put this out was to solicit feedback. I think there was Saga, which was a cryptocurrency based out of Israel, reached out and said that they were thinking of something very, very similar, and that's SAGA. But aside from them, no, very few and far between.
And what do you think? Like, I mean, some people argue like that. I'm like, I think I heard this morning, I haven't been able to verify it, that Aragon, for example, that took a vote yesterday, where less than 1% participated. The previous votes were similar, like 2% or whatever. And then some people are, you know what, in reality, there have been all these blockchain projects that have been created, but the only one that is really working for years and that for its custom-made purpose is Bitcoin, because everything else is just completely uncharted territory, which doesn't mean it doesn't need to be explored, but there's just too much hype about it. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean that's on the first point around the sort of on-chain voting protocols. Well, another one, Melon, is trying to do something different. Actually, Melon are another good example. Yes, the voting is very, very low, and so I don't think we have enough data points yet to prove that it's a failed experiment. But I do think that it shows how challenging it is to get the buy-in from large numbers of users of a network. Just from a time perspective and a voter fatigue perspective, I think what happened is many of these governance systems were thought through by extremely engaged, early adopters of networks who wanted to vote on everything themselves because they love the network and thought that everybody else would be like themselves. And I think as we grow to even 1 million users and beyond, we start having to onboard users that just want basic functionality or usability of the network. They're unlikely to want to vote on particular implementations or policies. So this is why I think that the Congress or the legislative model will likely win out, where there'll be delegates. Delegated proof of stake is already kind of a move in that direction, but related specifically to the validation of transactions. I think when it comes to governance, I think what Decreed are doing as well is something similar, where your governance or your vote can be delegated. And I think that is the very early steps towards an elected representative. I think we'll continue to see further and further delegation until we reach some sort of equilibrium point where we start reaching 50, 60, 70% percentage of delegates that vote on each particular proposal, and then there is some legitimacy in the network. But until we get to that point, there's lots of experimentation. And then to your point around Bitcoin specifically, absolutely. Well, we're 10 years in, and Bitcoin is still as robust as ever. What Bitcoin is able to do is able to solve its use case. It has a very, very specific function. Censorship resistance above all else, peer-to-peer electronic cash censorship resistance. Therefore, it has a very, very clear value that it's trying to uphold. You can make the debate that one particular stakeholder has concentrated power, the core devs potentially, and that actually the sort of the network or the companies that are building on top or the miners have little power. But ultimately, it's a tug of war at all times. But you're quite right. Bitcoin is and continues to be the most sustainable and successful global network. But we are still in the very, very early experimentation frenzy stage, where it's lots of new ideas around specific new types of consensus and different data structures are being experimented with. And it's my belief, and I certainly wouldn't be in the industry if I didn't think that there are some core characteristics enabled by both blockchains and sort of decentralized technologies that will act as sort of foundational to new computing infrastructure and architecture. And I believe that that becomes an important part of identity, but it also becomes an important part for lots of other, I suppose, lots of other use cases and industries over the next 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, my time horizon is pretty long on this stuff.
Wonderful, fully agree. Thank you so much. I think we have no further questions right now. Any final thoughts from you, Lawrence, you would like to share?
I think I would just like to encourage the audience to sort of, I guess, think through some of the implications for identity. I think it's such an important, in my view, actually, the single most important problem to solve. What does identity look like? When nation states are no longer providing monopoly on the provision and credentialing of identity. What does that look like in a digital world? I think is one of the biggest problems to solve, and I think it's critical, and therefore that we think deeply about how to govern such a network and to be completely open-minded to ideas that might go against the narrative, ideas that might just fundamentally be wrong or flawed. But I think it's beholden on all of us to think through all of the different lines of inquiry so that we end up coming up with a solution that's as robust and sustainable, I hope, as anything that the nation state has created.
Yeah, fully agree. And I really recommend to everyone to read the article from Lawrence. It's called "There's No Such Thing as Decentralized Governance." You have it on the link of this blog post that we published. If not, just search it in Google with that same title and Lawrence's name. This will be published very soon, like in the next couple of hours, probably, with the video and the Google Slides if you want to watch it again or share it anywhere. Tomorrow we will be talking to Drummond Reed about the Internet Identity Workshop and the main new things that came up in the Internet Identity Workshop that is happening today. And yeah, thank you so much for everyone for attending. Sign up to Telegram, Twitter, and or email newsletter to keep on being updated for anything happening on SSI Meetup. And Lawrence, thank you so much for having made some time. It was great having you with us here today, and I hope if you have new and other things coming up in SSI and governance in the future that we'll have you again with us.
Thanks very much.